Hello. Well, I'm going to talk about another kind of intelligence, one which we already have a lot of samples of and which we might expand within that space of possible minds a bit further. It's a kind of intelligence we know pretty well, the human brain, which in all its messiness, in all its lack of transparency, is very inspiring because it actually gives us existence proof that it's possible to have intelligent systems. And what I'm interested in is the technical challenge of turning that into a more substrate-independent form of intelligence. So my talk is to some degree going to be, well, it's side to side. In an ideal world, it would have been occurring concurrently with Randall's talk, which is going to be much more about the motivations and the other reasons. So his talk should have come before mine and after mine, but we can't do that. So, well, we have to fit with straight causality. So basically, why are we interested in emulating brains when it seems to be such good reasons to do pure artificial intelligence that could have many beneficial properties? One reason is that this is a very good exercise of actual forecasting. So it's a good training. We actually know quite a lot about brains, possible scanning methods, and we can start looking at timescales. So I'm hoping to show a rough timescale of what I would expect would be possible when we could achieve some form of brain emulation. And that in turn puts a bit of a time limit, of course, on artificial intelligence projects, because if you don't get there before we do, we're going to end up with uploaded humans. Which can be actually a pretty good thing, in my opinion. Although humans are not guaranteed any kind of friendliness, we know roughly how to deal with them. We actually have a lot of experience with dealing with human-like intelligences. I think we have some reasons to believe that we can deal with an intelligence explosion composed of software persons. That's something we might want to discuss during the questions section. I'm also probably not going to have time to deal with the very interesting issues of research ethics about this, because there are some very fun medical ethics and bioethical challenges there. But in general, I believe that this could be a very big thing. The philosophical impact, of course, of being able to demonstrate that we can exist substrate independent is going to get half of my philosophy department to tearing their hairs, which is always fun. And similarly, the economic impact. Robin has written a wonderfully scary paper about the economic impact of copyable human capital, which is essentially economic plutonium. Which is again suggesting that, yes, we might want to know how far away this is, because it could actually be quite dangerous. And, well, if you happen to subscribe to functionalism and various rather peculiar ideas about personal identity, this might also be the way to extending your life indefinitely. So, in general, what I'm talking about here is doing emulations. A lot of people have probably been playing around with emulations of previous computers. That ZX81 was my first computer, and these days, of course, it's safely packed down, but I can run exactly its software on my much more powerful computer. We have software that can do essentially a one-to-one correspondence of what is going on inside that little computer. And this concept is widely used in computer engineering, and the question is, can we do this with a biological system? So in general, this is about engineering without understanding exactly what's going on. What a lot of people in cognitive neuroscience are trying to achieve is, of course, understand what is the brain doing? How does it produce mind? What is memory, consciousness, or intelligence? But you can also study it on a much lower level. What does the neurons actually do? How does ion channels pump ions, and what are the electrical properties of that? So suppose you're an engineer and get just the drawings for this complex chip. You have no clue what it is, but you have the skills to put it together. That means that you could make new chips of that kind. Which of course means that if we have a low-level understanding of the brain, a sufficiently good low-level understanding, we could probably actually get something that could work. It would perhaps be even better if we had a great understanding of what was going on a high level. But a high-level understanding wouldn't allow us to actually make a copy. So in general, I don't have the time to get into the assumptions, but there is quite a whole bunch of philosophical assumptions, some of which are much more problematical than others, and some of which are quite interesting. In particular, there is the problem, is this mind uploading, or are we talking about brain emulation? I prefer to talk about brain emulation because I just get headaches of philosophy of mind normally. I don't know whether a complete simulation of a brain, one-to-one, would actually produce a mind. I find it pretty likely, but I don't have evidence for that. I want to test it. But so I'm interested in actually just getting something that does what a particular individual brain does in the computer. And then we're going to find out how powerful this model is. Similarly, we can think about the level of detail we're going to need. And this is where we end up with some of the interesting scientific disagreements, because we actually don't know where we would need it. Obviously, if we could make an atomic level copy of a brain, that would also be a brain doing the same kind of work, personal identity issues aside. But what about a high level? What if we replaced some of the structure, some of the functions? One possibility is, of course, that, well, you can get intelligence by just understanding the computational modules, stringing together some vision processing systems with some auditory processing system, decision-making systems, and creating a high-level model. That would most likely require very deep understanding of the brain and would probably not correspond to a particular brain. On the other hand, going down here, making a simulation of what goes on chemically in the brain would require very little understanding of what mind is or what memory is, but just a lot of data about what the chemicals are there and what are they doing and how to simulate it. So these levels, running all the way down to the quantum states, which I sincerely hope, being a very orthodox neuroscientist, that we don't need to deal with, because that's going to be computationally extremely expensive and require very different architectures from what I'm fond of thinking of. At some level, we could do this. And the interesting problem here is gradually we're going to acquire data. It's easier to acquire data on the low level. We're going to need big scanners, of course, but we don't need much understanding. The high levels, on the other hand, are computationally less expensive. It takes a lot of computation to simulate every molecule in the brain. Simulating every neuron in rough detail takes much less. Simulating abstract neurons like we do in neural networks is even less expensive. So we have a kind of race here between what we can do based on computational power we have available and the understanding we have. One of the deep problems, and this could actually break the whole project, is does there exist scale separation in the brain? If you look at a gas, for example, it turns out that what the interactions going on between the atoms and molecules inside the gas, to a very large degree, you can completely ignore using statistical mechanics, because they average together very nicely and you get pressure, volume, temperature, macroscopic properties which we can understand without talking about what the molecules are doing. Unfortunately, not all systems are this nicely behaved. There are, for example, turbulence, where stuff going on small scales calls large-scale changes. So you have emergence going up, very small-scale disturbances mess things up. But we also have, of course, the large eddies breaking down and creating small-scale things. So if there is no scale separation, like in the gas, we're having trouble simulating turbulence, and if the brain is similar, we're also not going to be able to do this kind of emulation, because we would always need the lower levels to do it completely. I'm rather optimistic about this. I haven't got the time to give good arguments why I believe there is at least a scale separation of the compartment models of neurons. But this is a scientific question we actually need to resolve. And that is very important. But we have a few fundamental questions we kind of would like to know before spending too much money on it. Another important thing is, of course, how much information about the function of the brain can we get from scans? So this is a typical electron microscope scan through some brain tissue, and it's a complete mess. Those pictures you see of beautiful neurons floating in the empty space we see in computer graphics are a completely false image of what's actually in the brain. The brain is more like a three-dimensional puzzle. And we need to figure out not just where the neurons are. This is, of course, three-dimensional, so you can see some branches going through the image plane here, but also, are they excitatory, inhibitory? Do we send dopamine or serotonin? And how much of that can we get from just a plain electron microscope image? Some people are optimistic about this. I think we might need to actually get some chemical data, which means we need some scanning techniques for that. Then, of course, on this side, really don't have time, various interesting complications, ranging from all the fundamental that the brain might actually be doing quantum stuff, over to some practical things. Well, what about the glia cells? The glia cells are also perhaps involved in some computation. They actually turn out to be not computationally too expensive to simulate. It turns out that, well, I'm skipping over the details. If we think about, let's see here, scanning. Well, the rough consensus we arrived at our workshop 2 years ago was that we probably need the cellular resolution, because most people there had a kind of sense that, yes, we need to get the synaptic connections, we need to know the cells. We probably don't need too much of a really low-level systems like the organelles. And that would require a resolution of 5 times 5 times 15 nanometer resolution, which sounds awfully fine. But it actually turns out that the techniques already that can go far beyond that. We need to figure out the relevant information, and this is the interesting problem. This is what's limiting us currently, being able to scan a large volume. Many of methods that have much better resolution can only scan a tiny voxel containing perhaps a micron or even smaller. And we want to turn actually the 1.4 liter brain. We want to scan that. Oops, let's see here. So there are, actually it turns out there are quite a lot of scanning modalities. You can probably not read these ones, but this would correspond to the required resolution. And there is quite a lot of different ways of doing it. And it seems that by extrapolating some of these technologies, we can go much further. Actually, there's a lot of progress here. So this is my favorite example. This is just using optical resolution, so it's not fine enough to actually achieve what I'm talking about. There are other technologies like this, but this could be seen as a good test bed. So this is from Texas A&M, the knife edge scanning microscopy. So essentially it's based on having a knife slicing through a fixated piece of brain tissue, scanning it as it goes along. And the result is, for example, this is an India ink stained piece of mouse spinal cord, which, well, I couldn't get the animation to work. You can afterwards in 3-dimensional reconstruct it. And I recently, thanks to Todd Huffman, got this really amazing, let's see if I can get this one to work because it's actually beautiful. No? The curse of getting cursors to move. Ah, yes, here it is. So this is part of the result. They actually scanned an entire mouse brain at this resolution. So they got terabytes and terabytes of data. So these are Golgi-stained Purkinje cells in the cerebellum of the mouse. Each of these ones got quite nice structure, the kind of little corals, and then there is a lot of fibers which you can't see in this picture because they're not stained, running through these branches. So they're part of a motion control system, and as you can see, they've got this wonderful alignment, not quite as messy as the cerebral cortex, which of course might interest us even more. The nice thing is, this is real data, and it's from a real project we have right now. We need better ways of handling this kind of enormous neuroinformatic data, but we seem to be well on our way doing that. There are also ways of getting the chemistry out of it. So array tomography is a very clever way of actually getting the chemical state of tissue, which you can scan at optical resolution. Then you can use electron microscope at the end and get the final resolution. This is being currently developed at Stanford. The problem is interpreting the scans. And that is, of course, going to take a lot of image processing. And this is an area which right now is scientifically somewhat underdeveloped. This is people are working on it, but more people are probably needed. Right now, you can do it by hand, of course. If you have grad students, you can just take a lot of slices and have them trace it and put it together in computer graphics. And it takes forever, but grad students are cheap. Yep, it's great to have them around. And this is, of course, why we need intelligence explosion, because then we're going to get even cheaper grad students. Of course, if we could automate this, you could get some rather amazing things. So there are already some interesting work on turning that messy, complex structure into this nice 3-dimensional thing. So the next step is, of course, doing the software that figures out where are the synapses and turns that into a computational model. Let's skip over this. And we already got some pretty nice and rather big computational models based on compartment modeling. So here is actually a Purkinje model, which I based on some other data. So this is kind of the stuff we usually simulate. So you divide the neuron into a lot of small cylindrical compartments, simulate the electrical and chemical signals going on in there, and this way you can also get, see what the electrical activity happens. Works very well on individual neurons, and we started to get pretty good computer power to do it. So one of my old office mates, I think he still got the world record of having a biologically realistic model of brain. So he ran 22 million neurons on a blue gene supercomputer, and it only ran 1/5,000th of real time, which I think is pretty good. The main reason it was not running real time was there was no real problem that it was slow, because it's intended for scientific publication. It's not intended to run around. It seems that speed is not the problem here. It's rather getting real data into it, because this simulation, of course, didn't use a scan of a real brain. It was constructed based on what we know of the connectivity. Well, we're going to need a body and world model. I don't have the time to get into it, but the computing requirements are relatively modest compared to the requirements running a brain. So in general, of course, well, you're going to see too many Moore's law here. If you plug in Moore's law, it turns out, well, we can do a rough prediction. Of course, predictions are problematic. I really like this version of Moore's law from Nordhaus. You might notice this little knee here. Before 1940, actually progress in terms of floating point operations per dollar weren't making much progress. And then it really took off. I think that's also a very important lesson for us. Sometimes these nice exponentials have surprising knees. There is another beautiful one about GDP per capita versus energy usage in America that was also a straight line until 1972 when it turned horizontal. Which means that suddenly energy efficiency appeared almost overnight, which is interesting. Supercomputers are showing a much nicer graph, and well, let's ignore these ones. So we can't start plugging things in. You probably can't read the details here, but depending on what level of resolution we'd need, all the way up to simulating individual molecules, down to having some kind of simple spiking network, we can look at what Moore's law would predict. So the blue line would correspond to the progress of supercomputers right now, which are mostly getting faster thanks to increasing parallelization. The red one would correspond to commodity supercomputers, and this would correspond to $1 million of computing power. So in this region, you can't do it. You haven't got enough computing power. If it turned out that you need to do the electrophysiology, the first point we could do it for $1 million supercomputer would be about 2040. The interesting thing is, of course, that we don't know whether we're going to end up with that computing power until later, so this is a kind of confidence interval. You also need to put in scanning, and this is a very rough thing I just drew. Essentially, right now we can't do it because we can't scale up the scanning. It looked very likely that we could scale up scanning if we really wanted relatively soon. So this region corresponds to where it would be feasible. So if you happen to believe that spiking network is the way, you could say, okay, at this point, we can do it for a few $million, which would be economically very powerful. If you believe that, oh, we need to do it up here, well, you have to wait until later. But if this is a problem that's simply parallelized well, so it actually turns out that we could do this a number of years earlier, depending on which model of computer progress you can do, and smaller brains can do it quite a lot earlier too. The interesting and slightly frightening thing is, well, the step from mouse to human is about 20 years, if it's just about computer power. On the other hand, if it turns out that, well, we get computer powers, but we're not bothering to scan, or we do the scans, but we can't figure out how to do simulation, then that could be much shorter, and that could have a social, political, and practical impact, which could be very confusing and negative. So, in general, there are some interesting problems here. I'm very happy to talk about those, since I haven't got much time. It seems that the important question right now is, well, do we want to speed this up, or not speed it up? I think for a good reason to speed it up, especially since we want actually the neuroscience not to be the limiting factor, because then we could get some rather nasty social surprises, and that would be ethically problematic. Similarly, as I said, the order matter, it's not urgent yet, but I hope I kind of give a hint here to you AI researchers that yes, this is ongoing. It's pretty likely to happen eventually. And if you think AI is a better shot, you better do it before this. And, well, let's ignore that. And, well, since I'm in a philosophy department, I have plenty of ethical issues, and that doesn't really matter now. I can take that in pause. Thank you. So, questions? Yeah?
So, if you were to emulate a brain, how complete would it be? Complete enough to matter whose brain it is? Would that brain have a personality?
I think it's unlikely that we would be able to do a brain emulation that wouldn't wouldn't be a person, that wouldn't be based on it, because we're probably going to need to do it at a pretty fine resolution. I don't think there is anything like a generic human brain, because the brain actually has an internal structure that gets formatted by experience. It is individual. So if we couldn't get the person we scanned, we would probably, if it was a successful brain emulation, would get something like an impaired version of the scanned one. And this is, of course, why there is some ethical issues about getting volunteers, and why I'm not very happy to want to be the first volunteer here.
Anders, could I interrupt you for a sec?
Yep.
Could everyone with questions please come to the front and use the microphones on either side and form a queue? Thank you.
While you're doing that, I can take a question. Yeah.
Blue Brain Project made someone's project statement that they expect a good possibility of whole brain human neocortical emulation within a decade.
Yeah. The question is, would it be an emulation of a human neocortex or something like a human neocortex? Henry Markram is doing amazing stuff on the cortical minicones, but he's just basing that on a few neuron data that has been scanned and studied at detail, which is a good start. But I think he needs to actually scan a real minicone and actually get its real data in order to say that now we're talking about a real cortex simulation. So I think simulation-wise and computer power-wise he's probably right, but he needs to put the kind of pipeline I was alluding to about scanning into this for it to work.
I just relived that you had mentioned the importance of scaling and especially quantum phenomena having an upward impact and all of that. Does your mid-century estimate include the ability to model the upward emergent impact?
It's based on the idea of upward emergence, but I'm not making any claims on the quantum stuff, because that would probably break my computational model in this case. I don't personally believe this. Stuart Hammeroff is, of course, going to disagree with me. We always do. So this is something we're going to kind of try out and find what evidence works. Yes.
Once we've achieved the whole brain emulation, what's your estimation and time frame for new kinds of brains, or taking the pieces, parts, and creating new structures from those bits?
I think we're going to be borrowing clever tricks from the cortex long before we have a full brain emulation. Once we figure out how the cortex actually managed to be a general data processor, that's going to be already a pretty big revolution in software. That might be very useful for an artificial intelligence. I think once we get a few uploaded people, besides the obvious ethical issues about the ethics of experimenting with what I would consider being thinking minds, you could do an awful lot of things if your brain was as editable as it would be in this case, including, of course, doing a lot of trial and error experiments, even run genetic algorithms on it, besides, of course, the obvious thing about speeding things up to the extent that works. So I think relatively soon we would see at least human minds plus. We would be tweaking them a bit, getting something fundamentally different. I think that's going to take a much longer, actually. But we can do an amazing number of stuff with our normal minds.
Thank you.
Hello?
Yeah.
My question is that recently we discovered about neuroplasticity, and the mind has influence on the physical brain. So I'm wondering, since most of your work seems to emphasize the physical hardware side of it, do you see maybe step 2 being a hybrid system where you do bring in what we understand about the brain, because there is a kind of cooperation between
of course.
these two things?
I would, being the monist I am, say, of course, that the mind and physical brain are so closely linked, but, well, the plasticity here, yeah, that's definitely something that has to be in. Otherwise, the brain emulation wouldn't be able to learn anything, which would be a big shame. So we need to put in a lot of plasticity, which currently rather limited the number of simulations about. But I think we can do that.
Okay. Yeah. Do you have any?
Okay, so it seems you got the last question, so this is a kind of lottery.
Anders, all human brains start out as a single cell. So have you considered eliminating the scanning problem by emulating a brain from scratch rather than having to take one that's already grown?
Well, I haven't done the calculations, but it's going to be pretty hefty to run this, because essentially you're going to be needing to run not just a brain emulation, but a body emulation and all the biochemistry involved in cells dividing and going through their formatting, etc. And you need to do that until the brain is well developed, which would, well, in the case of a baby, I say at least several subjective years. So yes, I think it could be done, but the computing power requirements would be extremely hefty. But there is an interesting possibility there. The question is, though, how do we learn actually what is going on? We're still going to need a lot of scanning and testing just to figure out what the darn cells are doing. Thank you.